This is Julie Pearson, Little Thunder with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at Oklahoma State University. It's February 3rd, 2020, and I'm interviewing fabric artist and weaver Jan Hawks for the Oklahoma Women's Artist Interview Series. Jan, you've been working with fabric as an art form really for a long time, probably before it became super popular. You're one of the early fiber artists here in Tulsa, and you invented the craft technique Sculpted Threads. One early show, a critic compared your creation to a piece of Chihuly glass. You're also married to the amazing wood artist Bob Hawks. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
You're welcome.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and when I was 3 years old, my folks moved about 6 blocks into Kansas City, Kansas. And so I was basically a Kansas girl and grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, very near the KU Med Center. And went to KU and then moved out of Kansas City after I graduated from college.
Any sisters or brothers?
I'm the oldest of 3. I have a sister who's 6 years younger than I am and a brother who's 14 years younger than I am.
Okay, and how about your folks? What did they do for a living?
My father was originally a mechanic, a typewriter and adding machine mechanic for Burroughs, and mother was a operator for Bell Telephone Company, Southwestern Bell in Topeka, Kansas. And that's how they met when he came to repair the machine that she worked on.
And you grew up on a farm, sort of?
No.
Okay.
I grew up in the city, right in the middle of Kansas City, Kansas.
Okay.
Yeah. My father was raised on a farm, but moved to the city because he had asthma. And so he'd gone to business school and learned to be this mechanic, and then eventually became a bookkeeper, had his own bookkeeping business.
What was the creative environment like in your home?
I don't ever remember my mother, my aunt, my grandmother sitting down without something in their hands, whether it was crochet or knitting or sewing. There was always something going on.
What is your first memory of seeing art, however you would define it?
Well, growing up in Kansas City, as a grade school, classes, we would be taken to the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. And so that was really my first exposure to art as art.
Were you thinking in terms of what you saw at home as being special in any way, or not yet?
No, not yet. I had interesting things around the house because my mother and dad were pig collectors. And they collected many different kinds of pig figurines. And so we had many, many, many pigs around the house.
Your first exposure to collecting.
Yes.
What is your first memory of making art, however you define it?
Well, my mother taught me to knit when I was 6. And that was the beginning. Of course, in the beginning, it was very simple scarves and things. As I got older, I got and was exposed to more forms of fiber art in particular. I got more interested in learning the technique, but then learning how to skew it a bit and do my own thing with it. And especially with the crochet and the thread, to make things that normally are flat and one-dimensional, make them into 3-dimensional items.
Right. So you have pretty much an amazing, you can sew at this point, I guess.
Oh, yes.
You can sew, you can crochet, you can knit. Are you doing anything else during the elementary school, junior high period?
No, just the things that we did in Campfire Girls. Maybe some paper weaving and pot holders and those kind of things.
And how about your art experiences in the school? How did they support or not your interest in these
I did not take any art classes in high school until I was a senior. And I had decided at age 13 that I wanted to be an occupational therapist. And it so happened that the art teacher in our high school had started out in OT. And she knew that I was going to need a lot of basics in a lot of different kind of crafts. And so my senior year in high school, I had 2 art classes. And one of them was with 8th graders, but she specially designed it for me. And she taught me basic weaving. She taught me screen printing and a lot of the things that by the time I got to KU and had to take those classes, I had an idea of what they were talking about. It was a big help.
That is wonderful. What got you interested in being an occupational therapist?
Well, I had always been interested in medicine. The medical field interested me, but I didn't want sick people and blood and things that a nurse had to deal with. And so this vocations teacher in my high school picked up on that and my interest in creating with my hands and my interest in medicine. And she's the one that put it together. I never had heard of it before, and I don't know that I would have until maybe I got to KU many years later.
Right. And, typically when you think of occupational therapy, you don't think automatically of crafts or...
It has changed. In the beginning, when I was in school, it was required. You always had to have what we called a purposeful activity to work with the patients. And the majority of my experience was with physical rehab. Patients that had had strokes, quadriplegics, paraplegics, and you would work with what they had and increase it. With stroke patients, you might be increasing the dexterity and the use of a left hand if they had stroked on the right, and teaching them how to use that left hand to do the things that they used to do with their right. Mm-hmm. And we had lots of ways that we adapted. We adapted looms so that when you would beat with the loom, there was weight on it that would help strengthen the arms. And we just did all kinds of adaptive things, and that really appealed to me. I really enjoyed that.
So you have this wonderfully supportive teacher, you know what your major is going to be, and you go to the University of Kansas. You mentioned a story about that University of Kansas. You were familiar with it.
Yes, of course, I growing up in Kansas City, and my grandparents lived in Topeka. And so when I was a child, as we would drive along the highway before the days of the Kansas Turnpike, drive along, and my folks would always say, now that's where you're going to go to school someday, as we'd go by Lawrence, and you could see the KU up on the hill. And I learned years later, Mother said we had no idea how we were going to send you. And then my father had inherited the family farm near Burlingame, Kansas. And so when they built the turnpike, they came and took the corner of that farm. And there was the money for me to go to college. And so with that, and with the help of a high school teacher who helped me get a wonderful scholarship at KU, I went to KU and was on campus for 3 years. As OT students, you're on campus for 3 years. And then your senior year, you go back to Kansas City and you have a semester at the Med Center. And so at that time, I lived at home because it was just 2 blocks from the Med Center. And then after that, you have 12 months of clinical affiliations, besides those 7 semesters of actual academic work.
Really hands-on training.
Yes.
Did you take any other art classes in college?
I took as much weaving as I could. Anytime I had an extra hour that I could squeeze in, I had weaving, and so I have 10 hours of weaving under my belt with credit.
Now, is that when you were introduced to the Biltmore sheep? You mentioned something on the phone about the sheep.
We were. I think I was about 13 or 14, and we were on a family vacation and went to Asheville, and my mother was big on learning about everything. And she knew about the Biltmore Industries. And so as a family, we went to visit the Biltmore Industries. And at that time, they had sheep that they would raise. They would shear them, spin the wool, and then weave it into fabric and sell it. And so we're going through their what do I want to say? They're not really factory, but they're workrooms. And they say and they're 2 men, and they're setting up a loom. And they say it takes 8 hours for the 2 men to get the loom set up. And I turned to my mother at that point and said, that's what I want to do. And she looked at me like I was crazy. And it was a few years later that when I was in college then and had started weaving, that they bought me a loom. And Mother was helping me set up the loom. And I taught her to weave. She went ahead and did wall-to-wall early American kind of wool carpeting for their living room.
What was it about weaving that attracted you at that point?
It just was fascinating to me, just fascinating, and what you could do what you could do. And at that time, I was doing only flat things. I
and
was
the
not.
size, right?
Yes,
and the
yes.
dimensionality.
Yes, and I was not seeing the possibility of doing three-dimensional things. I didn't get into that until when I was in Dallas then, and Dallas is where I went after I graduated, because I wanted to get away from the snow. But yet I wanted to stay within a day's drive of Kansas City. So I chose Dallas, went down there, and I ended up in a rehab center. And the rehab center, one of their sponsors were the Pi-Phis. And the Pi-Phis at that time had this wonderful craft school in Gatlinburg, Tennessee called Aeromont. And they, as their project for their 100th anniversary, I believe it was, they wanted to send me to Aeromont to go to school. And I could only be off for a week at that time. So they sent me for a week, and I loved it. I learned how to do vegetable dyeing, which was something I had not been exposed to. So then they came to me the next year and said, well, you only got to go for a week, and those classes mostly are 2 weeks, and so we want to send you again. So I went back, and after that, then I would take my vacation time, and there was about 5 years that I'd go back to Aeromont every year. But Aeromont is where I learned to do double weave, and that opened up doing dimensional things with weaving for me.
And were you also exposed at Aeromont to this notion of, sort of weaving as art?
Oh yes, very much so, very much so. Everything there was art. I also took jewelry classes, and I took a ceramics class, I believe, there, because you'd take 2 classes at a time.
Oh, cool. And Pi-Phis are?
Pi Beta Phi, the women's
sorority.
It's a sorority, but they call it a fraternity.
Okay, and you belonged to that?
No, I did not belong.
Did not?
I did not belong. I just happened to work at the rehab center in Dallas,
and they happened to be
that they sponsored. Yeah.
How interesting.
That was their project.
So at this point, you're not really doing any weaving that you're showing or selling. You're learning.
I'm doing some. Yes, I'm doing some. By this time, I have my own loom, and I'm doing some weaving
while you're in Dallas.
While I'm in Dallas, yes. And I got involved with the State Occupational Therapy Association, and we had the national convention in Dallas one year, and I was involved with that. And I wove a lot of wall hangings that were given away as door prizes at that convention, and those were mostly dimensional pieces. That was a lot of fun, and there was a lot of interest among the OTs, because at that time we were all using the activities. Modern occupational therapy, you walk into a rehab center and it's hard to tell the OT department from the PT department, because they are not using activities anymore. No, it's strictly weights and straight exercise. But it was amazing how you could get people to do things, and how they would work harder to improve their strength or improve their dexterity when they were doing something that was fun.
When they felt they were
creating something. Sure.
Yeah. When and how did you meet your husband, Bob?
After I had been in Dallas for 9 years, I had an opportunity when Hillcrest built the rehab center here in 1972. And the physician who was in charge of that rehab center, I had known from Dallas, because he had developed, his name was Wayman Spence, and he's the man who developed Spenco products. And he had developed this wonderful cushion that we used with quadriplegics and paras, because if they sit too long in one position, they develop bed sores. And he had developed this cushion that didn't happen with. And he had come to the rehab center in Dallas and showed us that cushion. So I had met him. So he's going to be the head of the department in Tulsa. And he contacts me knowing that I am the secretary of the State OT Association. And he said, do you know anybody that could head up this department? And so I'm racking my brain. And one morning I looked in the mirror and I thought, well, you idiot, you could go. Because I had been in that other job for 6 years and as head of the department, and there was no place else to go. So I contacted him and came up and visited with him. And it turned out later that it was me that he wanted all along, but he was so ethical he would not he would not say, "Hey, I got a job for you."
And you didn't automatically think of yourself.
No, I didn't. I didn't think of it that way. So I came to Tulsa in January of 1972. Brand new building at Hillcrest, brand new program. The 2nd of March, the architects that had built the building hired this commercial photographer to come take pictures of the building. That was the 2nd of March. And the woman who was the administrator and I had become friends during that 2-month period that I'd been there. And she'd known Bob for years because he had worked for the hospital. And so she invited us to go to lunch with some other people that day at the hospital. And so we did. We're neither one of us sure who else was there besides her that day. There were some other people. That was the 2nd of March. The 4th of March, we went out for the first time. And we were married the 13th of May in the chapel at the hospital by the chaplain.
That was a whirlwind.
I love to tell that. I love to tell that story.
That's wonderful.
And it will be 48 years in May.
Yes, that's wonderful. So, what was the arts landscape like in Tulsa at that time?
Well, I was really not aware of an arts landscape, so to speak, and through the years, and then I kept working for a while. And after I left Hillcrest after 2 years so that I could be free to travel with him because he was doing a lot of photography other places and wanted me to go with him. So I did. And so I started doing home health occupational therapy, which was completely different than what I had done, but I was still had my finger in. So 25 years after I had started at OT, I decided that it was time that I do something else. And so about that time, I learned about Stretch and Sew. Are you familiar with Stretch and Sew? Stretch and Sew was a wonderful program started by a woman in Oregon. And it was stitching and sewing, making garments with knit fabrics because people were not that comfortable. They were used to using woven fabrics, not knit. And so there was a whole program on the teachers. I was sent to Oregon to learn to be a teacher, and I did that then for 2 years. And then we were getting ready to build the house, and it was great, and I had a wonderful wardrobe because you always had to wear what you were teaching in class. But we were getting ready to build a new house, and wasn't quite as much money as I could be doing something else. So then I went to work at Utica Bank and worked there for 2 years. And then we started building the house, and I needed to be free to supervise and make decisions and such. So got the house built. And then for 10 years after that, I was a temp, and I worked in all kinds of offices, which was great because, again, I could travel with him when it was available. So,
what are some of the places you went that had an impact on your work?
oh, goodness. We would go to lots of different places. I can't think of any, just off the top of my head, anything in particular that...
But you were seeing art when you were traveling.
Yeah. And lots of times I had... One of the places that was really an inspiration to me was Philmont, the Boy Scout ranch, and he was photographing that. And the son had hired him to come photograph it because they had restored it and they had been able to find all of the original art. They had black and white photographs that were taken when Philmont was first finished. Mm-hmm. And they had found these things and they put them back, and Bob went in and rephotographed it. And so I'm helping him. I'm moving lights and such, but in between shots I have lots of time to look around and really appreciate the art and the beauty of that building. I think that was one of the most impressive things as far as art went. He did a lot of architectural photography and did manpower, so he was doing some seminar kinds of things. But that Philmont experience was really important to me.
And I understand you also saw an article on Seminole patchwork in Tulsa. Can you explain what kind of influence that had on you?
McCall's magazine had an article on Seminole patchwork, and I had been sewing. I had not done any quilting, but this was a matter of you took strips of fabric and sewed them together and then cut them apart and then offset them and sewed them back together. So you ended up with little squares, and it looked like you'd handled little bitty squares. Very, very tedious work. And that was in the days before. There's a tool now that the quilters all use called a rotary cutter that looks like kind of like a pizza cutter. But this was before that was made. And so I cut all of those pieces by marking them and cutting them with scissors. And people now, when I tell them that story, modern day quilters just can't believe that I did that. But that led me to, and I did a lot of embellishment of clothing with that, because that lent itself to doing a border around a skirt. And I taught some classes at sewing shops and such, and did that. And then that just kind of led me into quilting, because I got interested in quilting. And so I started doing some quilting and got involved with the Green Country Quilters Guild and met some people that way. And but I didn't want to do all of these patterns like they were doing. Mm-hmm. So I would take a pattern and skew it a bit. I have a quilt that's called Loosely Log Cabin that was just recently in a show here in Tulsa. And it's you look at it and you can tell it's log cabin, but it's not the precise exact like a log cabin pattern would be.
Right.
It's my version.
Yes, yes, it's a wonderful piece. Well, you almost could have gone into clothing design. I mean, you were making your own clothes young, and then you're wearing some of these things that you're making, but that didn't become an interest.
No. I enjoyed doing it for myself. Mm-hmm. And I did over the years. I did sew some for other people. I made several wedding dresses for friends, and my niece found a dress that she tried on in Kansas City, and my sister took pictures of her in the dress. And that was all I had to go by. And it was a bit of a challenge, but we got it made. What a
wonderful gift.
And I love that kind of a challenge.
Yeah. So when did you really seriously start doing enough of the work that you were also selling and showing simultaneously when you were doing the temp work, or was it later?
Yeah, I think when I was doing the temp work, and I was introduced to the Fiber Artists of Oklahoma, which was based in Oklahoma City, and started entering those shows. And there were several of us from Tulsa that would do that. And after the second or third show, we kind of got to know each other, and we would coordinate, because at that time you had to take the actual work. The juror would look at the actual work and decide what she wanted in the show. And then you'd have to go back and pick it up, what didn't get in the show. And then after the show was over, you'd have to go back. You'd go back for the opening, and then you'd go back to pick it up. So we began to make acquaintances and be able to carpool instead of everybody going on their own. And it got to the point where there were enough of us that the gals in Oklahoma City said, "You've got enough artists in Tulsa. We think you ought to start a Fiber Artists over here." So we did. And I can't tell you what year that was, but it's been quite a while ago. And so now we've got a very active group.
Was it in the 70s?
No, I think it was probably in the 80s.
In the 80s.
Yeah. Mid to late 80s when that happened.
And that's such an interesting difference between, in the 80s, if you're a visual artist, you can send in slides. They're expensive, but you can have slides done. But they wanted to actually see the work. Mm-hmm. Now, that has changed, and and so you do what I want to say. You do computer. You do photos and send them with your application, and the juror looks at them, and so she's got her decisions already made before she ever sees any actual work. And that's only been like in the last 5 years that's happened. That's interesting.
So we've come full circle and gotten modern.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the technique you invented, sculpting threads. And I understand one of the things that got you thinking along those lines was a trip to Nova Scotia, something you saw there. Yes,
Bob and I had gone on a trip to Nova Scotia. He had a niece that had a summer home in Maine, and we would go up there and spend some time. And so we decided we wanted to go into Nova Scotia, so we rented a car and drove on up there. And being a photographer, he wanted to photograph lighthouses. Mm-hmm. And so we were going all over looking for lighthouses, and we were looking for one in particular, and we thought it was down this road because there were not signs that say lighthouse down here. And so he stopped at this. There was a little house right at the corner, and just a little house, and it said gallery out in front. So he went in to ask directions, and pretty soon he came back out and he said, "You've got to come in and see this." And so I went back in and looked, and they had handmade things. Mm-hmm. But over in the corner, there was one little piece that was kind of a little bowl. And I said, "What is that?" And she said, "Oh, that's made out of thread." But she was not the artist. Somebody else had done it. And so she really didn't know how it was done. But that stuck in the back of my mind. And so later I got to thinking about that and thought, well, how could you do that? How could you make something out of thread? I knew about free motion stitching, where you lower the feed dogs on the machine and you use a special foot so that you're able to move. You have to stitch on something, and so you can move that through there. And in the meantime, the industry, as you know, when you have a polo shirt that's got a logo on it, it's got that scratchy white stuff behind it, because when they do the embroidery, it stretches the fabric. So there has to be some kind of stabilizer. Well, when people got sewing machines that they could monogram their own towels, they could not use that scratchy white stuff on the towels. Mm-hmm. So the industry wisely came up with a water-soluble stabilizer. So I learned about that, and I thought, oh, if I took that water-soluble stabilizer and stitched on it, could I create things? And so I started doing that. And then because of my involvement in the Quilt Guild, we had a speaker, a woman from North Carolina who had family in Sapulpa. And so she had come, and I went to pick her up from this family before she was to speak at our meeting that night, and brought her here because she wanted to change clothes. And I had a table just inside the front door that had some of these pieces that I had done on it. And she looked at those and she said, "What is that?" And so I told her, and she said, "You've got to write a book, and I'm not going to stop bugging you till you do." And she had tried to do a quilting book. She had not been successful, but she knew the ropes. So she told me how to get on the internet, get on the publisher's site, and they have information that you download if you've got a book proposal. And so with Amy's urging, I kept at it, and I was successful with Martingale. She said, "Now there's another company that they're doing something that's similar." And they were doing pieces out of thread, but they did not do them as stable as I did. And so then they would use acrylic on them to make them hold their shape. But my pieces are strictly thread and hold their shape just as they are. Okay. So then Martingale picked it up, and I had sent them samples of what I thought would go in the book, and they came back and said, "Well, could you do earrings?" Because I was mainly doing vessels and things. "Could you do earrings?" "Well, sure, I could do earrings." So I developed those. "Well, could you do purses?" "Well, yes, I could do purses." So I developed that.
You wanted some utilitarian stuff in there,
right. And they were very helpful. And I had a wonderful editor that we communicated by email, and I would do so much and send it to her, and then she'd send it back, and then I had to at that time, I had to keep a pad of paper on the sewing machine to write down, because I had done all of these pieces, but I'd not kept track of how many times I'd gone over it or anything. So I'm keeping track, layer 1, layer 2, in order to do this. And I'm sitting there working on this, and I'm 66 years old, and I'm thinking, what in the world have I gotten myself into? And then I begin to feel I've got my mother on one shoulder and my aunt on the other, because they are both gone, but they are right there urging me on. And so between them and Martingale, I got through it and got the project done. And so just before it was to come out, Martingale was going to Quilt Market in Salt Lake City. And they said, "We'd like to have you come and demonstrate at Quilt Market. And oh, by the way, would you do a half-hour presentation about your book for a group of people?" And there must have been in that room, I would imagine there were 75 to 100 people. And I'm talking about the book and explaining. And then when I'm demonstrating down in the hall, and they come along and they look and they their eyes get big, and somebody says, "Oh, look at what kind of sewing machine she's using. Look at that, that brand of sewing machine, and look at the thread, and look how much thread she uses." So it was fun, and it was fun to see people's reactions. It was different than just having the book come out and not having that person to person kind of exposure.
The impact.
Yeah, right,
yes,
right.
That's so cool. So what have some of your more important gallery shows been? A couple that you think were?
Well, I have shown work at 108 Contemporary here in Tulsa, and at OOHRP here in Tulsa. Over the years, the Fiber Artists annual Fiberworks show that alternates between Tulsa and Oklahoma City. And I've had work in that almost every year for probably 20 years.
Wow.
And different kinds of work in each one.
Right.
And then I've done some small shows and some individual shows. I have a friend here does beadwork, and she and I now do a show together at her home at Christmas time. And we have done shows with she and Bob and I here at our house before Christmas.
Neat.
And so it just, it kind of varies, happens with, what's going on in life.
Right. So what changes have you noticed just in the fiber arts world over the last?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that fiber art is now considered art. It is, in the beginning, it was not. If you weren't a painter, or a sculptor, you weren't doing art. But now fiber is a bona fide accepted art form, and it's just refreshing to see that and to get to be part of that.
Right. What's been one of the most ambitious pieces you've ever done?
I think there's a piece that my granddaughter has now that was a Juror's Choice Award for a fiber artist show here in Tulsa. And I called it March Madness, because I was working on it during basketball season, and being a KU graduate, basketball season, especially finals, gets to be real important. And it was a piece where the pieces that made it up were knit and crocheted, sculptural shaped pieces, not any two of them alike. Mm-hmm. And it was colors that ranged from purple at the bottom and then graduated up to bright yellow at the top. And the next year, it was so successful that the next year they used it on the poster for the Fiberworks show. But it's about 7 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. So it was one of the bigger pieces that I have done.
Very intensive and labor intensive.
Yes.
In terms of hours.
Yes.
Well, did you have any initial input into the idea of doing the show at the Hardesty Center or not?
This most recent one? No, Bob and I have been members of that Creative Cabal group since it started. And it was just a group of artists that got together and enjoyed being with each other and sharing what we were doing. And there was never any talk of a show. And then the group got to be larger, and there were more painters and artists who felt the need, the really burning desire to have a show. And so they were the ones that decided that we needed to have a show. And so and at first Bob and I have really kind of pulled out of that group. We just don't participate that much. Mm-hmm. But all of them kept insisting, you were part of the original group, you've got to be part of this show. And so we did put pieces in the show.
And originally, what were the benefits of belonging to that group when you started out?
It was the support of each other and the wonderful. You'd come up with something, and one of them would say, "Oh, that's great. What if you do such and such?" And one of the members of that group was Jim Watts, who's the newspaper editor, and because of Jim and things that I would take and show at Creative Cabal. He did several newspaper articles on me, including one about the book,
Oh, nice.
which was always kind of nice to have that
Yes.
extra little bit of
Have that connection.
yeah. And then I also had good press, not from that, but Glenda Sylvie, who was an anchor on Channel 6 here in Tulsa for many years. And she would interview artists. And when the book came out, she had me come on the show and interviewed me about the book. And Glenda and I are friends to this day.
That's wonderful. What's been one of the best compliments you've gotten on your work?
Oh, good. Oh, well, again, it involves Glenda. Glenda had a pair of my earrings that she had bought at one of the shows that we were doing locally, and they were Christmas earrings. And she walked into Margot's, which is a high-end shop in Utica Square. And the gals in Margot's just went nuts. Where in the world did you get those earrings? And so she told them. And so by the next Christmas, I had earrings in Margot's. And that wasn't the end of it, though. When I went to pick up the ones that they had not sold, they said, well, Valentine's Day's coming up. Could you do Valentine's? Well, sure. So I did those. And when I went to pick those up, well, St. Patrick's Day's around the corner. So I did St. Patrick's Day. Well, now, 4th of July is not too far away. Well, okay. So I did 4th of July. And then it was, well, how about Halloween? And so I did Halloween, and then we're back to Christmas. And so this is the third year now that I have done this cycle of earrings for Margot's, thanks to Glenda.
Sometimes when you're making a medium do something in these sculpted threads, for example, that the viewer isn't aware that it could do, it takes them a while to catch on or appreciate it. And I'm wondering what your experience with that has been.
That is especially so. And so I like to, if there's pieces in a show, like when we had the opening of the Cabal show, I tried to stay kind of close to my pieces, because people look at them and they're pretty colors and they're pretty shapes, but they have no idea how they are made. And when I tell them that they're made out of thread, and then thread, how in the world do you do that? And so then I go into greater detail about it, and it's fun to share that.
What's been one of your favorite creations?
Oh goodness, I think one of the favorite ones, and one that has had the most receptive, is a piece called Sunrise Sunset, and it's a set of 3 tall vessels that are blue at the bottom, and then they graduate up to orange. So, and at the bottom, I then beaded it with beads, so that the beads kind of look like they're splashing water. And so, to me, it's the sun going into the ocean. And these pieces have been just greatly accepted. There's one of the members of the fiber artists who is still mad at the juror from a couple of years ago that mine didn't get best in show for that show. She said those were the best pieces in the whole show, and they should have gotten the best of show award.
Artists often have an influence on another artist without being aware of it. I'm wondering if you've ever mentored anybody, sort of intentionally.
Not really. I have taught classes in the fiber, in the sculpted threads, but it's interesting. People are just not willing to spend the time that I have spent doing it. Even I taught a class one summer over in Arkansas, at the school over there. And my sister came from Kansas City and took the class, and a good friend of mine and a gal from here in Tulsa. And they all learned the basics, but I don't think any of them have done it since.
Right. You have to have that drive.
Yeah, right.
Have you ever had to give up on something because it wasn't working out?
I may put it aside for a while, but I don't ever say I've really given up completely. I'm not. I refuse to quit.
And it's not the sculpted threads in particular not like beadwork in the sense you can tear them out and start over. You just
No. You can add to it. You can cut it up and maybe use parts of it, but you can't undo it like you can undo knitting or something like that.
right. So let's talk about your process and techniques just a little more, and maybe also the machines that are important to you.
Well, the basis is this product that's called Solvy, and I like this one. This is the Ultra Solvy. This is the heaviest one, and it is a water soluble, like I said, water soluble stabilizer, and it looks like a piece of plastic when you.
That's amazing. Can you lift that up just a bit?
Yeah. Looks like
Wow.
a piece of plastic. And depending how I stitch on it, I'll cut off and start with a smaller piece. And depending how I stitch, for instance, if I want to make a bowl, and I'll start stitching up on all sides. And as I get the sides a little, wider, then I start stitching this direction, and then it pulls it in. Where if you keep stitching out that and you put more thread around the outside, then it begins to ruffle and you get a flower shape.
Oh my goodness.
And so if you want something to stay flat, you about have to stitch equal both directions. But this is the basis. And after you get it, I get it so that it's firm and it's going to hold its shape. Then I put it in water and this dissolves, and so you're left with nothing but the thread.
Nothing but the threads.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for showing us that. And what kind of, when you're doing sewing, what kind of a machine do you like to use?
I mostly use a baby lock machine, which is a basic sewing machine, and it's not a real expensive machine. You only need a machine that you can drop the feed dogs on, and older machines you were not able to do that on. And then I put on a special foot that doesn't come down tight against the throat plate, and so then you can move the material back and forth because you're moving it. You're not relying on the machine to pull it through.
I got you.
You want to move it whatever direction you want to use, and you use both straight stitching and zigzag stitching.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever utilized beads or shells or other objects?
Oh, I use beads a lot. Use lots of beads.
Actually, for the fountain piece you explained.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And when I was first starting, it was a little harder to keep the edges of earrings if I was doing it, and they'd get kind of raggedy. So I put beads around the edge to hide the raggedy stitches. But I love to do the beading. That is lots of fun to do that.
Each piece is one of a kind,
Right.
I'm assuming, but do you work in series at times or not?
Not really.
Uh-huh.
I made like the three pieces that are the sunrise sunset. Those I had vision, and I wanted to do three of them.
Right.
And sometimes I've got some big pieces. The work oftentimes lends itself to look like it's underwater kind of things, and so I will start with one piece and then I'll add something else, and then I'll maybe make a form for it to go in.
Yeah, that movement, that undulating kind
Right.
of impression it gives is really an important part of some of your pieces.
But I don't try to make a statement about anything. I just want pieces to be creative and colorful, and for people to appreciate like pretty flowers.
Right. what that material can do.
Yeah.
Do you keep a sketchbook of shapes, forms, textures?
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I'll get an idea, and so I'll sketch out things and have an idea. Right now, the fiber artists, we have a challenge for the year, and the challenge last year it was they did something each month, and it was basic quilt blocks, but it was dreams and birds and certain things. This year we have a different color each month, and it doesn't matter what you do because we've got weavers and quilters and dyers and all kinds of people in the fiber artist group. So, but whatever you do should speak to that color. So I have decided that what I'm going to do this year is to use those colors and make a series of flowers.
Oh.
And then hopefully I will have, at the end of the year, I will have a nice bouquet of flowers that can then be my entry in Fiberworks the next year.
That's a great idea.
So I am trying to think of different ways to make flowers. Because I have done the bumpy, curly kind of things, and so now I'm coming up with other kinds of shapes and sizes of flowers to do.
So does your research take you to botanic gardens, or how do you?
The first color was violet, and so I just got on the internet and Googled violet flowers, and so all these things came up, and so I started working on some and I'm doing little round circles that will be the wavy things, and then I'm going to put them probably on a stem, like you would get a silk flower on.
Yes.
Take that off and just use the stem, and put these kind of in groups on the stem. So that's my
Internet's a great resource.
It is a great resource, yeah.
How do you sign your pieces?
Sometimes I'm able to actually sign them, but because they're that rough thread, I had some special little tags made that say Sculpted Threads by Jan Hawks, and then there's a place, and they are numbered.
Okay.
Those pieces that get that. The jewelry pieces, I don't try to sign those. That's too difficult. But the bigger pieces,
all of your pieces.
All of my bigger pieces are numbered. Yeah.
What number are you on?
I think those big ones, it's probably 26 or so. Yeah.
Cool. So, what is your creative process, beginning with how you get an idea? When you get an idea,
sometimes it's a color. Sometimes it's a need to have a piece to enter in a show. Sometimes I'll see a flower, or I'll see something that will say, oh, how could I do that? How could I interpret that in thread? It just, and then sometimes it'll just come to me at night. Oh, what if I do such and such?
Yes, and get you up.
Yeah. Then I don't sleep for a while trying to figure it out.
What's your creative routine?
I don't always get to the sewing machine every day, but I like to, even if it's just for a short time. I have also gotten involved with a volunteer program with Women in Recovery, which is a family and children's service program. Mm-hmm. And we got started with that when we needed people to help do yarn bombing squares when 108 Contemporary yarn bombed the front of the building.
Yeah.
And so we went to them, and the first morning there were 4 of us with yarn and needles, and we were met by 14 women who had never picked up a pair of needles. And so we started them knitting, and about 5 months later we had enough squares, and these were people all over the state that were helping with these little squares. And when we got to the end and we said, well, that's all we need, and the girls said, oh, can't you keep on doing it? And so 5 years later, we are still, Tuesday mornings, there are 3 of us that are still going, and now we have added crochet.
Oh, how neat.
And they love to do it because and when we said, yes, we can continue with this, and they said, oh, that's great, then we can make gifts for our family. And these are women who have not been able to do things for anybody else. And so it's still their favorite thing to do is blankets.
Oh,
what do you want to do? I want to do a blanket. I want to do a blanket for my mom or for my dad or for my son or whatever. And so we are continuing with that. So that takes some time, and we get a lot of yarn donated, and we just put the word out that we'll take any yarn that you've got. So people oftentimes, when they clean out grandma's closet and she's got little balls of yarn, and we take those and I sort them by color, and then I wind them into a big, what the girls call an orphan ball, and oftentimes they end up this big, and that'll make a pretty good sized blanket. And it's pretty interesting to see what the colors are, and what color's going to come next, and how it's going to relate to another one.
Right.
So,
oh, what a great program.
So that takes up some of my creative time.
That's a great program. Well, looking back on your career so far, what has been an important fork in the road where you could have maybe gone one way, but you chose to go another?
Maybe if I hadn't come to Tulsa, I might have stayed at an OT working in rehab for the next 30 years. you know,
Right.
and not have had the opportunity to be creative, you know, to have had to continue to work to support myself and do my thing.
Right.
So I think probably that move to Tulsa was an important move.
And how important has it been to have a partner who is also doing art now at this point?
It's wonderful, and we have encouraged each other, and it's great to have that support and have somebody that can understand, and of course, being a photographer, he's been great help in photographing work after it's done, and probably got in shows that I might not have gotten in otherwise.
That's definitely a plus there.
Yeah.
What's been a highlight of your career so far?
I think the book, getting the book published, because I never ever in my life thought about writing a book, and that whole process was pretty magical, and it happened pretty fast. It was, you know, once I started, and Bob was wonderful support because he'd just take care of everything else so that I could create and get the deadlines met.
How quickly did you finish?
It was about an 8-month project, I believe, from the time I started until they wanted the completed.
Yes, that is quick.
That's a lot of machine time there.
Yes. What's been a low point in your career so far?
Oh, you know, there are times when you just kind of don't have an idea, and that's what happened to me this past year when it was time for Fiberworks. I just didn't have an idea, and so I kind of had an idea and something that I thought was interesting and attractive, and what I was doing was using double pointed needles and knitting circles with very fine yarn and very fine needles, and when you do that, they kind of roll and make like a tire or something. And to me, they were just fascinating. And so I was doing them in different sizes. And the inspiration for that came from my doctor's office, because in his waiting room, he's got several framed pieces that are circles of corrugated cardboard about this thick, and they're on edge. And they're all kinds of different design, no color, but just the different shapes and dimensions. And I thought, yeah, circles, that's good. So I started doing those, and I thought they were pretty clever. But the piece that I entered, the juror didn't like it, so it didn't get in the show. That was kind of a downer. That's the first Fiberworks show I've not been in many years. Yeah.
Well, it'll end up probably ahead of your time there.
Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to talk about before we look at your work?
I don't think so. I just thank you for coming and doing this. It's exciting to be considered an Oklahoma woman artist.
Well, you do fantastic work, and we're going to take a look at it here. So this is the type of work we really haven't talked about, actually.
When I was asked to be the featured artist at the gallery in 108 this past October and November, I decided, instead of my Sculpted Threads pieces, because I have had those in the gift shop for all the years, that I wanted to do something different. So instead of the Sculpted Threads, I knit and crocheted and then felted it. So the vase piece of this is a crocheted piece that was very loose, and then it went in the washing machine in hot water. And it does what happens when you put a wool sweater in the machine. It shrinks and gets very tight. And then I love to do the pieces with the crochet where you make them curl like that.
Yes.
And it's just a whimsical, fun, colorful piece.
Yep. And I love the ornamentation on the little bare twigs up there. It's really neat. Okay, and you mentioned this piece before.
This is the sunrise sunset piece. That is the three pieces that to me represents the sun splashing down into the water. That's the blue beads at the bottom of the water.
Right.
And this is the piece that has gotten a lot of compliments, and lots of people really like this. And like I said earlier, the one girl that in the fiber group is still mad at the juror that this didn't get the best of show.
I agree with her. Okay, how about this piece?
This piece, I had this piece of wood, which is part of a table leg that my uncle had sliced up. It's an old table leg. And I had it laying around, and I thought, that's interesting. And then one day I looked at it and I thought, well, how about flowers on it? So I did these, what I call clematis, and put them on the table leg.
Oh, they're just so beautiful in every detail.
And of course the centers are beaded.
Uh-huh. And it makes a wonderful wall hanging. And you want to talk to us about your quilt here?
This is loosely log cabin. This is the one that I said log cabin is a traditional, very precise quilting pattern. And I didn't want to do it precisely, so I did it my own style with the various, instead of the pieces all being the same size, they vary, and so that's loosely log cabin.
Got a great sense of movement in there, and yet you've got that old time feeling too, with the border and all.
Yeah.
And I forgot to ask about your machine.
I use a baby lock machine. I was using a machine that I had, which was an older machine, and when I got ready to when I was doing the book, and when I got ready to go to Quilt Market, I'm thinking, I don't think I want to take that old machine. And the Martingale people, the publisher of the book, said, well, there'll be machines there, we can get you a machine. And I'm thinking, I don't want to try to work on a machine I'm not familiar with. So I had a friend who was in the sewing machine business, and he worked for a sewing machine company. And I said, David, what do you do? And he knew what I was doing, and he recommended a baby lock machine. He said it's a workhorse. It's a workhorse. And so I have two baby lock machines that are not top of the line. They're bottom of the line machines, and they have been wonderful. They have been wonderful for me.
Well, it's been a pleasure looking at your work, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.